G20 Summit in Delhi was a resounding success. We managed to reconcile diametrically opposite views on Ukraine, for example. We managed to come up with a joint statement, which many people believe that is not going to happen. What I find really exciting is this new economic corridor, or at least the broad framework of that, a memorandum of understanding which has been signed on what is now being called the IMEC corridor. You know, the Americans have been trying to come up with some kind of a counter to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. India and Japan have been talking about collaborative projects in Africa, which do not follow the Chinese model. And I think the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which has now been conceived, the details are still being worked out, many of the details. But on the face of it, it is not only economically feasible and sustainable and profitable, but more importantly, it's a huge alternative to the BRI projects. The Pakistanis are saddled with these Chinese loans which they can't repay. They are saddled with these Chinese power projects and other projects which are unsustainable. And even more so because of the Pakistani economy, which is tanking. India is a $3.5, $3.6 trillion economy. The projections are that by 2030, India will be probably a $7 trillion, maybe even an $8 trillion economy. This provides you with a viable alternative to the BRI, and it's a massive pushback against the kind of inroads that the Chinese were making in many parts of the world, which are very crucial and critical to us, and also to our partners in the West. The Pakistanis no end, because they thought that CPEC, again, that was delusional. But the Pakistanis thought that the CPEC project is going to make Pakistan the center of the global economy. Like I said, it was delusional. I think it is a no-brainer that the G20 Summit in Delhi was a resounding success. Even the worst detractors of India and of the current political dispensation in India led by Mr. Modi, will have to admit that it was a resounding success. Not just the fact that we managed to reconcile diametrically opposite views on Ukraine, for example. We managed to come up with a joint statement, which many people believe that is not going to happen. The kind of show that was put up, that the entire year, the way India was showcased, the fact that we, in a manner of speaking, democratized G20 within India, made a lot of people from all corners of the country become a part of it, because events were hosted in many cities in the country, and a lot of people, it generated an interest in a lot of people. So yes, whichever way you look at it, the summit was a resounding success. But of course, this is something a lot of people have spoken about, and I don't want to belabor the point. To my mind, I think one of the most significant things which happened during the 2 days of the G20 summit was something which also happened on the sidelines of it. I'm not entirely convinced of the biofuel agreement and some of the other agreements, but I think what I find really exciting is this new economic corridor, or at least the broad framework of that, a memorandum of understanding which has been signed on what is now being called the IMEC corridor. Actually, the Pakistanis are calling it CPEC, as in SI, Saudi Arabia India Economic Corridor. So they're calling it CPEC, unlike the CPEC which they have, which is China Pakistan Economic Corridor. But that aside, The IMEC corridor, as it's being called, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, I think is one of the most exciting things we've seen in recent years. It has massive geopolitical significance, it has a massive geo-economic significance, and from an Indian point of view, it is something which which holds a lot of promise. Now, the fact that this project is probably one of the most concrete outcomes of deliberations which have been taking place for many years now. The Americans have been trying to come up with some kind of a counter to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. India and Japan have been talking about collaborative projects in Africa, which do not follow the Chinese model. India has been the original naysayer on what the BRI is all about. In fact, when all the countries in the world in the pre-COVID era were making a beeline to China and lauding the great vision of Emperor Xi, India was a standout, despite the fact that the Chinese tried to browbeat us, intimidate us, force us to coming and genuflecting before Emperor Xi when he was holding the first BRI summit. The government of India at that point of time stuck to its guns, dug in its heels, and refused to go. And we came up with a very clear and very cogent criticism of why we think that the BRI is not a very good project for the countries where these projects are coming up. Most of them were economically unsustainable. Most of them didn't make any real sense for the countries in which they were being built. Many of them were white elephant projects which would saddle those countries with really nice swanky infrastructure, but which was unviable, unsustainable, unpayable. And that is what finally informed many people around the world of what is now called the debt trap diplomacy of the Chinese, or what somebody like me would call neo-colonialism with Chinese characteristics. So there were deliberations which were going on to come up with an alternative model which would develop stakeholders, which would be economically viable and feasible, which would actually generate economic growth in the countries through which it was passing, or countries which could link up to these projects. And I think the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which has now been conceived, the details are still being worked out, many of the details, but on the face of it, it is not only economically feasible and sustainable and profitable, but more importantly, it's a huge alternative to the BRI projects. And the fact that it is being done under the rubric of something called the PGII, which is essentially a partnership, that's what the full name is, Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And I think the operative word is partnership. And it's not one country which is going to be funding these projects, one country which is going to get maximum benefit out of it, one country whose companies will get all the contracts. This is not that kind of project. This is a partnership which will be both public investments and private investments. There will be conglomerates that will be set up. It's not just a rail route running from on the Arabian Peninsula into the Mediterranean and then on to Europe, but it's a multimodal transport project, quite like the CPEC is. Many people, and there are these usual suspects in India and elsewhere who keep talking about whether this is a viable project, as though CPEC is a viable project, because most people who look at the CPEC have never studied the geography and the terrain from which CPEC comes. what are going to be the throughputs of products in that on that economic corridor. The viability of it is already coming under question. The Pakistanis are saddled with these Chinese loans which they can't repay. They are saddled with these Chinese power projects and other projects which are unsustainable, and even more so because of the Pakistani economy which is tanking. And now that the Chinese economy is also on a go slow, the Chinese don't have the kind of money. They were sloshing around all over the place, buying politicians, buying people to sign on to their projects, which they thought would give fillip to their industry and their companies. So this is a very different kind of a project. It has multiple. It will have multiple stakeholders. It is extremely viable. So even if you look at the map, the CPEC would have come up to Gwadar. And I don't want to get into the details of what the route it's going to follow. But after Gwadar, what? It was going to use the sea route. So even in the IMEC project, the idea is to use the ports on India's western coast, Bombay maybe, and perhaps Kandla or a couple of other ports which have come up on the western coast, link up to the UAE, then a rail line which transports the goods through the Arabian Peninsula onto Jordan, into Israel. People are saying it will be the port of Haifa, which is a very modern and a huge port, which incidentally is being run or being operated by an Indian business group, the Adanis, who are running some fabulous ports even in India, and then on to Europe. And then it will go through the land-based systems, both trains as well as road, to supply goods to Europe. Now this essentially is a project which links India to the Middle East onto Europe. Now why I say that this is eminently doable, it is economically sustainable and profitable in fact, and feasible. Is because currently, look at the volumes of trade which are taking place between India and the UAE, or India and the Middle East, and onto Europe. India does roughly about 125, 130 billion dollars of trade with Europe. We do about $50 billion of trade with Saudi Arabia and close to $85 billion of trade with the UAE. This when India is a $3.5, $3.6 trillion economy. The projections are that by 2030, India will be probably a 7 trillion, maybe even an $8 trillion economy, which means the size of the Indian economy will almost double in the next 7 to 8 years, which is probably also going to be the time frame within which this project is going to come online. Now, almost more than 50% of India's total GDP, which means that if we are now going to be talking about 7 to 8 trillion dollars, it means roughly about $4 trillion of that is foreign trade, and a large part of that, roughly about 60 to 70% is, you could quibble about the numbers, will be with the Middle East and Europe. So look at the quantum of trade that is likely to take place as the economy grows, and also the Middle Eastern economies are also going to be growing because of the kind of investments that are coming in to those countries. And it's not just Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but there are other countries also which are going to get linked on to this when this project comes about. So one is the sheer quantum of trade. Now much of the trade currently moves through the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal already is quite crowded, and even the Egyptians were thinking of building an alternate Suez Canal. But if you come up with a route like this, it becomes even more viable because it provides you a kind of an alternative. You can never replace the sea, the traffic which moves on the seas, that is of course always going to be far more viable, and you can move a lot more goods on the seas than you can over land. But even then, this kind of a project with the capacities that will be built up will serve as a kind of a viable alternative to Suez, number one. But this is not just a transport corridor. This is also an energy corridor, and this is also a communications corridor. Because there are going to be fiber optic cables and all kinds of stuff which is going to be laid out, because that is where the future of the modern economy lies. So clearly the economic viability is built into the concept of this project. Secondly, this is a project which will actually stabilize the Middle East like nothing else can, because Israel is going to be very much part of the project, and you cannot have countries at loggerheads with Israel being part of the project. So this kind of addresses one of those issues in the Middle East which have always kind of stymied the growth of the Middle East to the extent they could have grown and done business with each other. So it addresses one of those issues. Again, there will be a lot of complications. A lot of things are going to be added on. There will be a lot of carping sounds that will come. But despite all of that, when you look at the big picture, this holds a lot of promise. So politically, there is a lot of significance to this. Geostrategically, again, quite clearly, this is an alternate vision, which some Indian political leaders have accused India and other countries of the world of not having an alternate vision, as though BRI was a great vision statement by the Chinese. It was predatory, like everybody knows, but even so. This provides you with a viable alternative to the BRI, and it's a massive pushback against the kind of inroads that the Chinese were making in many parts of the world, which are very crucial and critical to us, and also to our partners in the West. So this addresses that particular issue as well. To an extent, and I think this is why there is growing disquiet in China, it kind of undercuts the entire BRI scheme. And that is something which I think the has made the Chinese sit up and take notice of what has been pulled by these countries from right under their nose. There is some speculation that the fact that it was on the very first day of the G20 Summit that Prime Minister Modi announced that an agreement had been struck, and they waited for the next day to announce the IMEC. There is some speculation, and I can't vouch for the veracity of what is being said, but it is that they wanted to get an agreement from the Chinese before they announced this particular project. Otherwise, the Chinese could have played the spoiler. But they were not able to do that. But there is a sense of disquiet that does this undercut this very ambitious project for global domination that the Chinese emperor had unveiled. So at one level it addresses that. At the same time, it has spooked the Pakistanis no end, because they thought that CPEC, again, that was delusional. But the Pakistanis thought that the CPEC project is going to make Pakistan the center of the global economy. Like I said, it was delusional. The Pakistanis have suddenly woken up to the fact that, look, India is now developing corridors, and this is incidentally not the only corridor. There's another one which is also being developed and which has already started working, which is the corridor through Iran into Russia, the INSTC. But that there are problems in that, because there are all kinds of sanctions and financial issues involved. But even so, on the Chabahar port, the second stage of the development of that port, I believe, has already commenced. So there is that corridor as well, but this is the corridor which holds the real promise. Now, the Pakistanis have suddenly realized that, damn, the Indians have kind of bypassed us completely. So what are we going to do with the CPEC? What's going to move through the CPEC? In any case, the CPEC does not have a pipeline, it does not have a railway line, so nothing really moves through CPEC. If at all CPEC was supposed to be a replacement for the Malacca dilemma of the Chinese, it's simply not there. It can't be done. So the Pakistanis are spooked, and they suddenly think that they are left holding the can of Chinese investment with no way to pay for it, because who's going to come to Pakistan when they have so much opportunity in India and along this corridor. Then of course there is the wannabe caliph of the world, Erdogan, who was also getting into a bit of a funk on this issue, and as though somebody was asking him whether he opposes it or is okay with it. So the Turks have announced that they have problems with this IMEC corridor because they have been bypassed. Very good that they've been bypassed. They were not really bringing anything to the table anyways, and their opposition really doesn't matter. But what is probably affecting them is the fact that the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Arabs in general, because within the Islamic world there is this three-way kind of a competition between the Turks, the Persians and the Arabs. Again, I'm dumbing it down a bit, but nevertheless, you get the idea. And the Saudis are now picking up the slack and moving forward under the leadership of MBS, who's got some great ideas. And of course, the UAE royal family and the UAE president, MBZ, both of them great visionaries, and under their leadership, the Arab world is again acquiring a kind of salience which over the years it seemed to be losing out on. So the Turks of course feel a little concerned about that, and secondly, I think the Turks are also feeling a little left out, because there is a lot of talk, and now this is where you start fitting in Mr. Modi's visit to Greece. There is a lot of talk that Greece will be part of this corridor, because maybe one spur of it, or once the goods leave the Asian landmass and go to Europe, they will probably be using some Greek ports apart from Italy, and maybe some ports in France. Once you are in the Mediterranean, you could use whatever you want. But there is some talk of using ports in Greece as well, which means that Greece becomes a part of it. The Turks, in a sense, are left holding the can. And frankly speaking, I have no love lost for the Turks, simply because of the kind of bloody-mindedness they have shown, the way they have tried to stab us, and they continue to do it on issues of core interest to us, like Kashmir. The Turks have been at the forefront of developing this entire propaganda narrative against India on Kashmir, because they are so closely linked to the Pakistanis. But if they want to go with the Pakistanis, then I don't see any reason why India should be doing anything to soften the blow on the Turks. So I think that is the kind of broad scenario which seems to be developing under the IMEC. It's a fabulous project. President Biden has already announced that within the next 60 odd days, there will be something more coming out, some more details, some more flesh being put into how this the whole project is going to be structured. But it's very clear this is an eminently sensible project. It's not a white elephant. It is sustainable, it is feasible, it is doable, and most importantly, it is something which actually will prove to be a game changer, unlike the so-called game changing projects and destiny changing projects which have actually ruined the countries which have become part of those projects. Countries like Pakistan becoming part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which was called the flagship. Now, quite clearly, that ship has drowned, the flag is down, and that's that project. But this project, I think, is something, the success of which could change that entire framework within which connectivity projects are being built, because of the kind of partnerships, stakeholders it's bringing onto the table, and it's creating some very exciting possibilities for all the countries which get involved in it. So kudos to all the leaders who have conceived of this project and have gone ahead with it, and this is something which I think we all need to look forward to. In fact, something we all need to push, continue to push the country to double down on this project and ensure that it just does not remain at a conceptual stage, but is actually operationalized as soon as possible.